My name is Bryce Crum. I am an associate penetration tester with Avertium. And the topic today that I'm going to be talking about is from OSINT to Pwn. And the primary topic of this is going to be centric around kind of a different viewpoint from what most people experience when discussing open source intelligence. So with open source intelligence, you're typically getting a forensics viewpoint or some form of kind of investigative viewpoint, I would say. And for this purpose, this talk's going to talk about how an attacker, or in this case, a penetration tester or red teamer, can utilize that same information to kind of enumerate and have access to situations and services we may not have identified or been able to breach previously. So that's kind of the overview very quickly for the presentation. As just kind of quick introductions, as I said, my title with Avertium, I have held many different roles in the past. I've been a C# developer. I've been working through business systems analysis. Went into security operations center for a time. I worked as a red team member for quite some time, and then moved into my current role. I personally kind of describe myself as a perpetual noob. I'm always trying to understand and learn new things, but I always find myself, even when I get the grasp on the smallest thing, I believe, oh, now I've got, some general understanding. I realize how massive that web truly is, and it's the impossibility for me to have understood it at that level. So it's one of the amazing things about our industry. You think you've understood everything about a room, only to turn your head and realize you were standing in the far corner. So really an enthusiastic viewpoint there. I am also an ETSU alumni, as well as an offensive security certified professional. I have a wonderful wife who deals with me putting presentations together and kicking her out of the house to give presentations. I'm also a hobby jumper, which basically is a terminology I didn't know existed, but fits very well, which means that I jump from hobby to hobby, depending on the day, as well as depending on what I'm feeling. Here recently was rock climbing, but with COVID, we all know how that goes. And then the primary thing that you'll notice throughout these slides is I'm a meme lover, and I have quite a few of them throughout. So if you're not interested in memes, I apologize in advance, but you'll see quite a few. Quick disclaimer though, all the views that I express during this presentation are my own and don't necessarily represent the opinions of my employer or any entity who I'm currently or past associated with. It's just, very generic standard disclaimer. So diving right in, as I go through each of these to kind of give you some more insight, I never try to present attack methodologies or any form of offensive standards without giving some form of a background around defense tactics as well. So each category, as we go through, I will give an overview of the knowledge that you're going to be looking for, the insight that you're trying to gain from that category. Then we'll move into the attacks that we typically perform with that knowledge after accumulating it, and then some defenses that can be performed to prevent me from being able to get that information, or to slow me down at the worst. So that'll kind of all come into play after the introduction. The other side of that, through this overview, each of these categories are going to build on one another. They're put in this order for a reason. So typically, this is my methodology. Obviously, there are many others who may have a much better methodology, but this is the one I prefer to use. And from that, it's kind of ever expanding. But the general way that I progress is I'll follow through from general information, users and email addresses, kind of hunt down a little bit into passwords and secrets, and then enumerate system information and source code where available. So that's kind of, you'll hear me refer back to previous categories as I progress through. Just know that these kind of build on one another. So I guess to start off, what is open source intelligence? Well, from the viewpoints that I've seen most people discuss and kind of the other ways that I've seen it described, it's basically data that can be obtained publicly from multiple sources, any source that doesn't require some form of authentication or is bound in some way, to be then used to process and make a decision, and typically to make an informed decision if possible. So a lot of times when people discuss open source intelligence, you'll hear social media, you'll hear around information around blog posts or the very generic, well-known sources. But the other things to consider are repositories, DNS information, academic papers, court information, as well as the common other ones, blogs, videos, articles, so on and so forth. So there's a lot of data that accumulates into open source intelligence. And with it kind of comes various definitions depending on the environment you're in. Once again, this is from an attacker's perspective. So we'll be covering a bit more around the obscure as well, as that tends to be where we're going to find more interesting information. So starting off with general information, when I typically begin these types of these OSINT investigations, as they were from an attacker's perspective, it really depends on what environment or what engagement I'm going to be dealing with. Obviously, if I'm dealing with an external penetration test versus a web application assessment, those are two completely different spheres, and I'm going to be targeting completely different information depending. So obviously, it's kind of the start game with what do you know, or what has already been provisioned to you when you're starting off. In dealing with very specific engagements where a client or someone has came in and given very detailed information about what they want assessed, it then changes the way that these types of information gathering and building and utilizing that kind of passive recon, if you will, being able to take that information in and use it is changed quite a bit, because the more specific the engagement details, the more specific the open source intelligence has to be to match it. So obviously, if let's say someone has come in and decided that they want an assessment done that they've said you have free reign, basically here's the name of the company, go figure information out, then give us the option to decide whether or not it's in scope. But we just want to see what's there, right? That obviously is a very broad scope. You're in a situation where you're going to be doing a lot more open source intelligence on a lot more aspects and a lot more areas. Whereas if someone comes in and says, these are the exact hosts I want checked, these are the exact services on those hosts I want checked, I want, XYZ done, that then that narrows down the amount of research that you're going to be doing and what you're currently targeting. So the biggest hint there is to read the information, because that information is going to not only narrow the scope down as what you're going to be doing, but also gives you the benefit of understanding some other intricacies around what you're going to be doing with this assessment and the network that people are dealing with. So general information, what you're going to be going after, depends on what you started with, but realistically, the things that I always try to grab: names, anything as far as aliases go around someone, addresses, phone numbers for the company, especially around company directories or front desk, things of that nature, email addresses, if you can find them right off. We get a lot more into that later, but this is kind of the generic, if you will, first page of Google moment, right? Websites, their domains possibly, that are just immediately apparent through SEO, images, videos, so on and so forth, just grabbing the quick things. What I will say is on images and videos, I tend to leave those out until much later on as I'm progressing through, simply because it's kind of a time sink. And obviously with these types of engagements, as well as in the real world, a real world attacker doesn't necessarily have an infinite amount of time, although we'd like to talk about that from time to time. Unless they're extremely dedicated, more often than not, an attacker is going to be trying to gather information on a large number of targets, right? And they only have a set amount of time they're willing to spend. And it's kind of the same idea from a penetration test perspective, unless it's a very targeted situation, obviously. So how do we attack general information, right? Obviously, okay, we've pulled names of locations and we've seen some pictures of the buildings they have. What are we doing with this information? Well, this tends to be the foundation that all the rest will be laid upon, right? This will give you, the more that you can gather and generate and pull together for this type of baseline, will give you basically the structure you'll build the rest of your attacks on. So anytime that you run into information, even if you may find it very tedious, if you will, it may be valuable. Make a quick note of where you found it. Even if it's something that doesn't get used, you have source notes for it. You can go back and find it. Some of the ways that I typically will immediately jump into: password list generation. If you've got information already that you've built up around individuals or the company, products they sell, things of that nature, the things that you can pick up fairly quickly on, like I said, a front page of a search engine, right? Take that information, dump it into tools like Crunch, Cups. Cool is also a really good tool if you're going to be doing web scraping. It's a good tool for targeting a company's website and generating password lists off of it. Obviously, password lists come into play in multiple attacks, but realistically, it doesn't by its own nature give a direct attack. So more often than not, you're not going to be pwning from general information, right? And don't forget about rules. So especially if you're dealing with an internal situation where you're going to be doing internal engagements and you've captured hashes, now you've turned back to that password list you generated during the information or general information session. Use rules to go ahead and get the most out of that password list, because very minute changes such as a 0 instead of an O or a $ instead of an S, the standard modifications that people make, are the types of things that tend to throw off standard password cracks, right? From social engineering standpoint, the more general information you can gather, the more credibility you have. I've actually found myself in some of my own situations where I've needed to social engineer my way out of sticky situations, or I've been in a situation where I need to discuss with an individual to get access to an area. And just knowing basic information that a corporation would expect an employee to know gives you a level of credibility beyond the general populace. And sometimes that's enough to convince them to allow you to then continue on. Obviously, it depends on the context, and obviously, the information that you're going to be using is going to vary dependent on who you're discussing with or what you're targeting. But by and large, just very generic information such as building number or a store location or store number or whatever information else you can pull can give you a lot of credibility when dealing with a persona that you've put together for social engineering, as well as for phishing campaigns. Physical security comes into its own here. General information is typically going to be the biggest data dump that you can get around physical. If you're going to be targeting from a physical perspective, you can get a fairly strong understanding of the electronic security controls that are in place. You can get a strong understanding of kind of the physical security as far as locks, possibly door handle styles, right? Maybe if you're going to be deploying stuff like an under door tool or things of that nature, you may be able to pull information such as camera locations and the parking arrangement, understanding where to park and where to move and see the flow of where individuals tend to stand and move within a location is extremely valuable. Anytime that you can get that information, definitely go after it. Obviously, Google Maps typically strips out cars from parking lots, things of that nature, but you can typically see it inside of corporate locations where they've added images to their website or things of that nature, especially if they have buildings that they're particularly proud of. That can be a lot of great insight into understanding the normal business operations and flow to give you a lot of credibility. Also, it kind of plays into the same dress code. That way you don't have to do as much active reconnaissance. You don't have to risk yourself being there in inappropriate attire necessarily. If you are going to be targeting a location and you're assuming they're business professional, you show up in a suit and tie and you watch and everyone's walking in with khakis and a polo on, then you've put yourself in a situation where you're highly likely to be detected while doing recon, right? Even if you're just sitting in your car, you can still be noticed. And so it's kind of that situation of you're eliminating that aspect if you can gather that information here. And then the biggest one, of course, is the doors and windows. That's your ingress and egress points. That's going to be how you get in, get out. Whatever you can do. And also understanding the door controls, right? Can you tailgate? Is there a situation where the door is not a turnstile or something of that nature? You can just follow someone in, or is it a turnstile situation where you're going to need electronic controls to get into the building? Is there gates? What kind of other security controls are you going to have to bypass to even get in? So security kind of comes in, or physical security kind of comes into its own during general information gathering. So how do we defend with people gathering general information? Well, typically defense side is going to come into a weird situation with general information where it's almost going to not be worth the battle depending on the populace you serve, right? So if you have a client group that is the general populace, you can't risk closing down information such as phone numbers or email addresses or things of that nature from search engines because you need that for business. It just makes logical sense there. But if you are someone who is, or if you are representing a company that does not have a direct need to share that information, try to get business listing information unlisted, right? Anytime that you can unlist information, that's more digging than an attacker has to do. Can they still get it? Most certainly. Are there a number of tools out there that can get it? Most certainly. But the more you unlist, the harder it is to find. Reduce web presence. So it's kind of the joke, the counter opposite of doing development. In development, they talk a lot about optimizing search engine optimization, right? Getting that down to where your keyword searches are nailing every single time. If you're going to try to be avoiding people finding even general information about your company, you don't necessarily want search engine optimization in play, as well as reducing the web presence as much as possible. We'll get into that more later. Consider reducing the social media posts you make. Obviously, if you're at this level, you're probably not making many social media posts, but if you are, make sure that you are making, the most out of the posts that you do use, and that there is something in the process that is making sure that security is considered as you're progressing through. Something that allows for individuals that are making these posts to have a second set of eyes, that has the mindset of a security professional, and knowing that background image of the card reader at our door may give away insight into whether it's kind of your low frequency 125 kilohertz or high frequency card reader, right? And the cure can be worse than the ailment here. So realistically, many of these may not be valid options for your company or the options that you use to defend your company. So keep that in mind. You can't be locking down the fortress when there's other holes, or if it's, you can't pull the drawbridge up if you need the population to come in. So moving on to users and emails. This one's kind of in three parts. I typically break it up. The target that I typically go after first is to identify email patterns. This tends to be what I will build the rest of the list on. This tends to be what username, as if any of you are able to catch Michael Berardi's talk on password spraying, this tends to be where I'm going to build the username list that I'm going to utilize for password spraying out of. All of it depends on me identifying an email pattern typically. Taking that email pattern and applying the identified users, which comes in the next category, that generates the list. So how do you identify those email patterns? I typically like to use generic tools. Obviously, you can just go to a search engine, pull it up, throw in an email or throw in a domain name and see if you can kind of enumerate through the or metadata there to find an email address. If you can't, and if you can't make a informed decision off of even 5, 6 there, I like to use things such as hunter.io, which has kind of done all of that for you, where they do the scraping. You just go in there, punch in the domain, and it will spit out what it believes is the pattern. Obviously, that's not going to work for companies that have multiple patterns. If they're using 4, 5, 6 different pattern styles, depending on department or depending on whatever, that can all come into play and make it much more difficult for an attacker. The harvester, I've had some luck with it in the past. It hasn't really, I haven't had as much luck with it here as of late, but it definitely was pretty powerful in the past. And then Recon NG has various modules as well. Really powerful tool, great tool for various portions of open source. I don't myself tend to use it as often, but it is still, many of my colleagues do, and it's an excellent tool. Identify possible users. At this phase, this is where you're going to be enumerating who works there. That's basically the goal you're going after. Pulling as many names that you can, past or present, and putting them to a list to then be transformed based on the patterns identified during the previous stage. So LinkedIn is probably the most valuable target here from my experience, simply because it tends to be a socially accepted way for people to correlate to a company without having a company directory on the website. The only thing with LinkedIn is that when you attempt to go to a company page and make that navigation, typically they're going to require you to have some form of degree of relationship with individuals to then be able to see their name. That's the benefit where LinkedIn Lion accounts. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that, but it's LinkedIn Open Networking is what Lion stands for. LinkedIn Lions will connect with almost anyone, just simply as a way to try to prevent gatekeeping and allowing people to come into industries that may be more difficult to kind of pull that all together. Typically, it's not necessarily a difficult way to find, even if you don't have a lion. your way into a company and be able to see the listing. A decent persona will get you in. But even beyond that, a lot of search engines for public profiles, you can actually directly do searches around in title and do specifics like dash LinkedIn or dash the company name, Insight LinkedIn, and you can pull back a list of users that have public profiles without ever having that degree of relationship. So that's another way that you can kind of work around it. Company directories obviously come into play here. That's a huge source of knowledge if they're available and public and online. Social media, I don't tend to find as often. Sometimes you'll get lucky there. It's kind of hard to make the correlations, and a lot of times you get a lot of false positives. Search engines, as I said, you can do those particular, I believe the proper term is Google Dork for it. You can kind of identify very particular patterns and then utilize those in advanced searches to find users. Another kind of gray area of open source intelligence is metadata scraping from public files or files that are hosted on a website that a user has of some sort, web server. Grabbing those files down and then enumerating the metadata out of them to find users is a great way to identify a company that may be using usernames that are non-standard or not the local part of the email address. Obviously, that's something that will kind of break the chain that I have currently, right? And if you're not aware of that fairly early on, you can spend a lot of time generating these possible usernames only to find that the username is actually an alpha character followed by multiple numerics, right? So some really cool tools on the scraping for metadata, PowerMeta, Metagoo file, I'm sorry, and many others. Custom scripting you can do. This tends to be kind of an area where I'll go to from time to time. I'm not going to always do it depending on if I already have some insight, but typically it's something worth doing if you're not certain why you're not getting results in some of your other attacks. So attacking users and emails, obviously the easy one is a phishing campaign. Taking those email addresses that you've enumerated, putting them to a direct use by emailing the users with the general information that you've already enumerated about the company can give you some varied success depending on the target. And especially the more general information you gathered, as I said, that's the foundation. So piling that in, if you find out they may be going through some form of company transition or something of that nature, that can be extremely powerful ammo to then pack behind a phishing campaign. Building possible username list, as I said in the previous slide, same idea, basically taking those users that you identified that do work at that location, I guess at that point employees, taking those employees, appending them into the standards around email addresses and things of that nature to then generate lists. That can be done very easily with Python scripts or things of that nature. There's plenty of tools out there that can do it, which we'll get into in a minute, but it basically, password spreading is still valuable. You can use those usernames against any service to try basic passwords, season 2020, ! And all the other commons. And check for previous breaches. So if you do get email addresses that you have identified as valid by some manner, whether that be through a web app that's giving a verbose error message on login or something of that nature, or you have an OWA server, which makes it really easy, take that information and run it through previous, information like such as Have I Been Pwned by Troy Hunt. Great tool for defense as well. But it's also something that can give an attacker insight into whether this individual has been compromised before. Maybe they're still reusing this password somewhere else. So defending users and email addresses is primarily around kind of the unfortunate situation of security by obscurity, which of course, as we know, is not security at all, but it does make it more difficult for an attacker. Non-standard email formats is very frustrating for people who are going to be dependent on tools to generate that information for them. I've seen one that I saw at one point that about broke my mind for a moment was first initial, middle name, last initial as the email layout. And although that's still something that an analyst that sits down and performs a check on, or an attacker that sits down and performs a check on, could very easily create a custom script to put together. Trivial action there. It's not something that you're typically going to find in the common tool sets. So if it's someone who's more dependent on the tools, you may be able to escape that. It also can be extremely valuable to vary the styling and the format of emails internally if possible. So each department has a different styling of email layout for the local part. That can be extremely frustrating to an attacker because the list gets ever growing larger and larger as you're trying to make the all possible enumerations of this, which makes it easier for defenders to detect this type of attack, right? Especially if you're going to be going from like a password spray or something of that nature. So use separate, difficult to guess usernames. Don't make the local part of your email address the username necessarily. There's other alternatives that you can do that are better options. And be careful who you add on LinkedIn. As I said, the minute that you add someone on LinkedIn, you're adding them as a degree, and everyone that you know and everyone they know just became correlated to that person, at least to the point of being able to see their name and their company affiliation. So keep that in mind. For passwords and secrets, this one tends to be a lot where people don't believe it until they see it necessarily. This happens a lot where, especially obsoleted technologies such as forums like Google Groups, things of that nature, where people were using them prior to maybe migrating into an internal Teams or something, like a Slack, something of that nature. If there was ever a shadow IT presence before, or if there was ever like documentation that was being publicly shared and maybe they didn't want to have to worry about adding everyone each time that they got new people, you may run into public Google groups or things of that nature that you can enumerate through and identify processes and things of that nature. I have found documented processes in Trello boards before that included information such as usernames and passwords. So always something to be aware of. I believe Trello now, by default, it's private. You do have to forcefully make it public through multiple error or warning messages, but still something that was out there and still is. Wiki pages, blogs, things of that nature. I don't run into those as often. Sometimes if the company has them and they've just forgotten them with legacy situation, you may run into that, but it's not as prevalent. Videos. So I mentioned in the beginning that I typically leave videos and pictures till much later in the process. Well, this is where I tend to come back to those. Videos and pictures can give you a ton of insight to secrets and possible keys, passwords, physical keys, physical badges, things of that nature. So much of that can be seen in videos because people don't necessarily think through how the marketing video is viewing the background, right? They're focused on the initial shot. They may not even have a blurring in the background. You'll see that a lot more with older videos, or training videos as well. Many a time I've jumped on to a site where someone has been given a seminar, and you hit the seminar and you look back, and on the whiteboard, there's credentials, right, to probably a wireless network or something of that nature. I've seen that multiple times in multiple environments. And it's something to keep aware of, right? It's not just YouTube. It's not just Vimeo. Find out what that group is using, identify those videos, and see what you can see. Sometimes it's going to be too poor of a quality as far as the video's resolution goes to be able to pull interesting information. Other times it's going to be as plain as day to anyone that was willing to look outside of the directed scope of a video. And images in the same format. Finding public code repositories today is a little bit harder than it used to be, unless it's been purposely open sourced. Even still, if you do run into this situation, check for uploaded config files. A lot of repositories are trying to prevent people from uploading secrets anymore, API keys, passwords. It still happens despite the best effort. There are those developers that will just completely ignore warnings. I used to be one at one point before I turned to security, so I can attest to that. So you kind of have to really consider that, and there's that awkward moment of making sure that you're properly deleting it and not just resubmitting them and creating a history situation where the history can be reviewed for credentials. Attacking passwords and secrets, obviously there's the blatant one, which is if you've identified credentials via a repository for a particular service, go try the credentials on that service. If you've identified credentials via a whiteboard or something, go check those against wireless network. If you've identified credentials on a sticky note in a video, go check those for AD or something of that nature, right? There's the obvious side. But even if the credentials aren't immediately active, right? If they've been deprecated in some manner, they're still valuable. There's credential stuffing. You can use those credentials across multiple applications. Password reuse, as I said, is still a thing. So you may run into that and be able to utilize that. There's also the pattern deriving patterns out of them. So obviously there's the common one that everyone laughs at, which is the season, year, and an exclamation mark, right? Taking that, any attacker is going to be able to glance at that and guess that the next one may be spring or summer, right? But there's also the other side of that, which is phrases that people will typically use. An example maybe be like, this is a password, let's say for our web portal. So this is a password web portal 1, right? Or company name Bang. Well, if I take that and move it into a situation where I need to get access to another service, right? And they named it after the service, then this is a password, that service name on Bang or whatever will more than likely give us the same result. So be looking for those types of patterns out of any credentials that you accumulate as you're going through this process. With social engineering, there's been a lot of attackers actually utilize this methodology. It's something very effective. Many of you will probably remember a few years ago, there was a situation where there was a phishing campaign being sent out where people were attempting to exploit the fear of public shame for someone who the attacker would claim that they had gotten a hold of a video of them in a compromising situation, and they would include a previous password from a known data breach for that email address, and in hopes to force that user to believe them that they were able to compromise their system. So with social engineering, especially to those that don't have a very strong understanding of computing, it can be extremely impactful to them to see what they believe and hold as something that shouldn't be publicly available at all, and kind of can give validity to a threat, right? So kind of comes into play there. And then from a physical security standpoint, this kind of comes back around. If you see pictures of keys, if you see pictures of badges, things of that nature, there's a ton of information you can pull from that. If you see a picture of a key and it's high enough resolution, or even if it's low resolution, but you can get it laid out just right, there's many a talk out there about people cutting keys from the bit layout of the key. You can put them over, well, there's grid overlays that are publicly available to cut a key. Those all come into play here. Clamshell badges, the old school kind of the 125 kilohertz badges, 26-bit or 35-bit hidden readers, right? Those badges a lot of times will have numeric values written on them. From time to time, those can actually be the badge number and the facility code. Alternatively, you may run into a situation where you see a barcode on a badge. If you scan, or, obviously from a user standpoint, you don't really think much about that barcode being visible. From an attacker standpoint, we can interpret that barcode, and it typically is something such as the badge number, facility code, sensitive information that you don't want to be giving away. So how do we defend this? Obviously, the primary around defense is to know what's out there. Be aware of what you have going on in your own environment around shadow IT, around any form of external systems, know how they're being used and by what departments and what they're storing in those systems. Establish an end-of-life process. So this is what bites a lot of people, is as they're migrating from tool to tool, they never really set a process to handle ending the usage of that previously used service. So make sure that you have a defined end-of-life process and how to handle that service once it's been completely, disregarded as far as the company goes. Make sure that that's useful and not something that's too difficult to follow, and something that if you do have a shadow IT environment, that they will try to follow it as well when moving away from the shadow IT environment as you bring them back into the standard environment when we discuss later on about system information. Conduct audits of source code management. Know where your source code is. Why is it there? Who needs access to it? Why do they have access to it? Obviously, with open source intelligence, we're talking about this from a very public viewpoint. But if you are in an internal situation and I get a hold of a low privilege user and they have access to a source code repository, my first question should probably be why? Why did they have access to that? Did they truly need access to it? So conduct frequent audits of who has access to your source code. With systems and source code, this tends to be where you're going to be pulling the most data from an attacker standpoint to move into the next phase. So this is going to be information that's kind of an immediate translation phase, if you will. With domain information, who is information, DNS records, subdomains, all of that are extremely valuable. You can pull that. Those, of course, correlate to some form of IP address or some form of tie-in that gives you more insight into the environment they're using, whether they're in a cloud environment, whether they're on-prem, who's managing the situation. There's all of that information publicly out there and available. Who is information will also give you unique insight that you can kind of dig into by looking at email addresses that the domain was registered with, what other domains have been registered with that email address, what other domains have been registered under a particular company, making those correlations, and then continuing to dig through the same way in a loop, as we'll get through later. It gives a lot of insight to a lot of hosts that maybe even the client didn't realize were publicly available. So make sure to, if you're on the defending side, make sure that you know what's out there and that you're doing this yourself. From an attacker standpoint, we're going after those unknown hosts, so be willing to dig in really far and do this loop multiple times. Public ports and services. Typically, this is where an attacker is going to move into active reconnaissance and start throwing scans at systems. But if I find myself in a situation where I'm dealing with a assessment that's not going to provide me a whitelist or something of that nature, or a accept list or something of that nature for traffic, then I'm going to go ahead and move into a kind of more stealthy approach, which is to use these public scanners that already provide information for me. From like Census.io, Shodan, things of that nature, they can provide port information as well as the services running. Shodan Premium actually will give you a screenshot of if it tries to make a connection and what the view looked like. Census will give you header information depending. And you can kind of start to build a system persona around what the system's supposed to be doing and how it's supposed to be implemented for their environment. And the more that you can understand around the personas of each system, the more you begin to understand their network without ever having touched it. And so it can be a really powerful tool without having to risk getting blocked via scans. And then, of course, as we mentioned before, finding code repositories, that's kind of the holy grail situation. It opens up so many possibilities, and so much time can be spent in that realm that is, you can deep dive to find low-level exploitations. You can find SQL injection that would be blind, and especially situations where you're dealing with time-based blind injections, right? You're not going to be able to pinpoint those very easily from an external viewpoint unless you have a very particular query or standardized set of queries that work frequently. A lot of times, especially unstandardized, or if there's a very particular layout for the query, you're not going to be able to pinpoint that. Things also such as deserialization vulnerabilities, so on and so forth. There's just a whole number that opens up with code repositories. Attacking standard information or system information and source code. At this point, it's around the standard tactics, right? Taking that information, enumerating that, bringing it back, determining if there's vulnerabilities out for those versions, understanding why those versions are employed, and if they have any default credentials or the standard falls that people fall into. I always suggest performing active recon before you move into the attacking phase for system information, because you need to verify that that's up to date and hasn't been outdated, especially if you're dealing with a cloud environment where services could have been changed. Also, social engineering for system information and source code. This would be a very targeted principle. This is going to be if you're going after help desk, or if you're going after a technical individual and you want to come in as maybe a consultant viewpoint or something of that nature, and be able to act as though you have a very intricate knowledge of how their networks are operating to try to build that trust very quickly. It can be helpful if you are going to be putting on the persona of the help desk and contacting a user, but by and large, this level of information, not as much. With this, when you get into the code review aspect, as we talked about, identifying those exploits that are difficult to locate in publicly available code can lead to exploits, but I'll also warn once again, time is a valuable asset when it comes to these types of situations, and remembering that can give you, unless this code base is very prominent and used frequently, right? And in which case there are other better resources, which we'll get into here in a minute, to be doing so from an attacker standpoint. you may not have as much value going down that rabbit hole for too long. Defending system information and source code. Privacy protection is always a good idea, even for major and larger companies. Just having that protection in place to prevent users from being able to make those correlations. It does make it difficult on defenders as well, being able to pinpoint, but it's a situation of it's a give and take. The auditing external host frequently is something that, regardless of your viewpoint on the rest of this, you should be doing. Forgetting an external host is out there and having a vulnerable service on it is a very problematic thing, as we've seen with so many times SMB's issues. So know what's out there, know your network, right? Ensure that all the services are needed publicly. If you have a host that is serving a web server and you are publicly serving the database that's on that same server that's utilized for the web server, you don't need that database publicly available. Go kill that port, right, to make sure that you're not allowing that access. Well, kill the port externally. So make sure that you understand what services you truly need externally and why. This can be extremely difficult for larger companies, but it's still something valuable to be doing, and if it's not being done, it definitely needs to be considered. Performing source code reviews is an excellent option if you have a lot of open source projects and that you're going to be dependent on them to remain that way. You kind of have to depend on the community. It may be a good move to not only do it through a standard code review, but also to employ bug bounty programs and things of that nature to try to keep that code secured as best as possible and prevent that information from falling into the wrong hands to be used by people you don't want. With all of this, a lot of these issues are going to spawn from people taking action on their own. So discuss best practices with your admins. Provision the repositories that they need. Make sure that they have the team communication resources that they need and want, because avoiding those situations, avoiding those discussions with your admins and developers is going to lead to that awkward moment of shadow IT environments throughout, and those can be extremely impactful. So some quick final thoughts, kind of wrapping up here. This is a rinse and repeat methodology, right? Take this and kind of apply, I believe the original loop's name was the OODA loop from, I believe it's a military reference. Take that observation, orientation, make a decision, and then act upon it, right? And you're going to be progressing that throughout this open source intelligence process. Once you've found your way through the external and you're found your way onto the internal network, this isn't over necessarily. As you find new services, as you find new users, as you find whatever, you can rinse and repeat this process to find more information. Don't get lost in the hunt, though. Obviously, time is money, right? And time is a very valuable thing. And a lot of times there are a lot of data that you can be going through, especially if you're not just looking at the company, but also looking at the individuals. There's a ton of money that you can spend in hunting that as far as hours go, or you can spend that time maybe looking for the easy wins. So don't get lost in the hunt. If you've found nothing else and you just absolutely need something, go crazy, but it's something to keep informed and knowledgeable about. Time is a commodity. As I said, open source intelligence is only one part of much larger assessments by and large. So use this as a tool. As you progress and use these methodologies and find your speed, you're going to be able to bring this together fairly quickly, kind of get your own mentality down and move through it and do it quickly, right? It's not going to be something that takes you a lot of time. But that being said, be weary, especially if you find yourself with a lot of time left and you're just trying to find a way to piece together these minor little bits at the end. Make sure that you're not spending time there when there could be much more valuable areas. And then the biggest one is have fun and teach each other. None of us are masters of everything, right? And especially with open source intelligence, I am far from a master of it. I know people who are infinitely better at it than I, and I have learned so much from them as this community in every way. But it's so interesting, these types of topics, to come together and have these communications and discuss teachable moments, even to to the client and end users, those who don't have the technical knowledge necessarily, because you can bring that together and bring them into the understanding that can help them to secure themselves and not only their company, but also themselves and their family as they progress on and learn more about these types of external facing information they're providing to others. So have fun, teach each other, and enjoy it. So any questions, concerns, considerations, otherwise? Let's see.
You're probably talked out. I haven't seen anything pop up over there yet.
Okay.
Does anybody have any questions for Bryce?
Let's see. Looks like I just pulled up Discord.
Oh, no, I'm not over in Discord. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, no, I was going to check through here and see. Maltego. I actually don't use Maltego, or I haven't. Primarily simply because I haven't ran into a situation where I've needed to take the time to kind of compile that data in mass together. I've heard that it's an amazing tool. By and large, when I'm taking notes of this information, I have my own scripts that I run to kind of pull it together into notes and stored in locations. So it's just kind of my own thing that I have together. So let's see, any other. I would try my best to recover the data. Ransom. As far as the ransomware question, that's a highly debated topic. I don't know that that's something. As far the question for those who are not in Discord is, the individual had an interview question where they were asked about if they were hit by ransomware, would they try to pay for the ransom to recover the data, and from my perspective there, it's a situation by situation basis. Most people will always say never pay the ransom, and that tends to be my own viewpoint as well, simply because it may be a destructive malware, and unless you truly understand what you're dealing with, you may never get the information back anyway. But can you tell the sources for code? Source code is, or like GitHub repositories, Bitbucket repositories, those types of things, you're typically going to find if you know the service you're looking for and you're doing searches through that, that's going to be how you're going to find those open repositories. So that's just kind of the two bits I have for that. What tools or frameworks do you use to track results from open source intelligence? RG, like I had said, I kind of keep my own thing. I just have a list of scripts that I kind of use. Maltego is a good one for compiling that, I've heard. And there's quite a few other sources and tools out there that you can use to bring it all together. Like I said, by and large, since I'm kind of moving through these quickly, I just use what I'm comfortable with, which is the scripts that I wrote. So. All right. And I don't see any other questions. Anything else?
It looks like, what is your favorite overall open security intelligence? And then the tool list looks like over in the regular Zoom chat. I don't know if you see those yet or.
Let's see. Okay. Yeah, evidently it's not showing. Oh, there we go. What's your favorite tool overall for open source intelligence? As far as favorite tool goes, like I said, I tend to use, there's a ton of open source tools out there as I listed through the slides. Probably the ones that I use the most are going to be around probably passive total. I use a lot for if I'm in the system information phase, direct link-in information. I have, like I said, I've got a lot of custom stuff that I've written along the way that there are much better tools out there to do. But it's just one of those, when you're in the moment, like at least for me, I tend to be really bad about that. I'll be in the moment and I'll just craft a tool to handle that situation that I'm in right at that moment, instead of going out and trying to find a tool that I can familiarize myself with. So I have a lot of those, but I would say that probably the most commonly used tool that I'm using frequently for open source intelligence is probably through Passive Total to gather, like I said, that DNS loop, getting that information, identifying the IP addresses, pulling that back together. They have both a free and a paid version, but I tend to just stick with the free because portions there. So, all right. Well, if no other questions, feel free to reach out to me. I'll be in Discord for a little bit. So feel free to hit me up there. It's Bryce there. Yeah, and thank you all for your time.